far and away the major, most important rocket-armed aircraft in the American arsenal was the F-89 Scorpion, taking us back to Le Verrier's system. This aircraft could launch 104 of these missiles. They were spin stabilized, so they were supposed to be more accurate, and they would cover the area of a football field. You launch one of these the following way. In the nose is a Hughes radar, a fairly brand new invention of the Air Force at the time, and you have a radar operator in the back. What you do is, like with that Zeppelin, you attack from the side. 2 reasons. Bigger target, you're not going to get hit by the defensive fire because all Soviet bombers had cannons in the tail. So you launch the missiles and hopefully you bring it down. But do you? I always wondered, because it struck me that this was a bit of a crapshoot, whether or not you're going to hit anything. And I looked at the literature, I couldn't find anything, and I thought I'd never know. And one day at the local hobby store in San Jose, I run into a pilot who's of F-89s. And I asked him the very first question, did you ever hit anything with those? First of all, he told me, these rockets aren't cheap. You don't fire them very often. In your career, you might fire it once or twice. And you fired at targets that was being towed. So it was hard to tell. But he was dubious they would hit anything. So I asked him, I said, what are you going to do if you have a Russian nuclear bomber on its way to an American city? You fired your entire salvo and you missed. What do you do? He said, no problem. Air Defense Command had a policy where you break down a bomber each aircraft. So they were going to ram. And that was the policy at the time. Of course, that would result in the loss of aircraft and crew, but that was what they would have done. This picture shows the end of the unguided air-to-air missile. Under that wing of an F-89 Scorpion, you see 2 red missiles, and those missiles have heat seekers in the middle. So these are now guided missiles. They're not the target. They're not what we're going to talk about right now. But that large white missile on the end is very special. It is an unguided missile. There's no guidance system at all. But you only need one. It's the Hughes Genie missile, and it has a 1.7 kiloton nuclear warhead. And you fire this blindly at the target and hope the overpressure will destroy it. Now, a lot of people were a little upset about the idea of the Air Force firing nuclear weapons on top of cities to prevent atomic bombers from dropping nuclear weapons on the city itself. So it's some counterintuitive, but the Air Force assured everybody it was safe. And to make sure it was safe, they took a group of 5 officers and put them in a field and had the F-89 Scorpion fire a Genie missile and detonate it over their heads. If you want to see what happened, go to YouTube, Genie missile test, and you'll see. In conclusion, those of us who lived in the 1950s and went to bed confident in the knowledge that the Air Force would protect us from Russian strategic bombers, I wonder how many of us would have slept well knowing that the Air Force was depending on a system developed by the French in 1960 and then abandoned as unworkable in 1970. Aerial cannons. This is probably the first cannon-armed aircraft in history. It's lost in 1910. There's no great significance because it never flew nor never fired the cannon, but it just showed Busan stinky. However, that is a 37 millimeter cannon. We'll be talking a lot about cannons of this caliber. And I think you should know why. At the St. Petersburg Agreement in 1883, it was decided that naval armament would be limited to 74 millimeters. The reason the 37 millimeter cannon was developed by Hotchkiss was they needed something to fire training rounds. It was cheaper. So this cannon you see that we mount on most aircraft basically is a gunnery trainer for naval troops. This is a very cool picture. I like this one. Art and I were very excited when we discovered it at the SAJA in France. First of all, it's a Boisson 6, which is very, very rarely illustrated. But don't worry about that. That's not so important. Look on the nose. That's a 37 millimeter Hotchkiss cannon. Now, these cannons are not automatic cannons. I'll talk about in a minute. They're very hard to load. They're very hard to fire. Who better to do it for you than a naval gunner? So look on the top there, and that is a Navy man. So at least some escadrilles managed to Shanghai a Navy man to fire the gun for them. This is the most commonly used gun, the Hotchkiss 37 millimeter 1885 cannon. It is large, it is immediately, and it is not automatic. You have to open the breech, put in the shell, put in the charge, close the breech, aim, fire, open the breech, take out the shell, and repeat again while you're in an open air aircraft flying in combat, and it's not very stable. It is not an easy weapon to use. Successes were not common. but it did give them the value of long range. The Voisin cannons, this is the Voisin 4, the most commonly used type. This is a lineup. The French went in for cannons in a big way. This is an escadrille called BC for a Voisin cannon, and there were a number of these. Now, what is the role of this aircraft? Initially it was thought, well, we'll do air-to-air gunnery. But I showed you why that wasn't a very good idea. You're not likely to hit anything that's nimble with a weapon that's as unwieldy as this, an aircraft as slow as this. Well, you could hit Zeppelins, but there weren't very many on the Western Front at that time. And Drachenballoons, balloons, as we said, were better brought down by incendiary ammunition by a much more nimble aircraft than this. But it did have use. It could be used in the ground attack. There, the aircraft found its forte. And it's interesting to note that the Voisin bomber units, BB escadrilles, often were accompanied by VC bombers, or VC aircraft. And the reason was those Voisin 4s would use their shells to also attack, ground attack during the mission, and even were used to shoot at the searchlights that were shooting at the bombers, making them the first suppression of enemy air defense aircraft, commonly known as wild weasels in history. Now, a naval weapon would go great against naval targets, so now why not put it on a flying boat? This is a Tellier flying boat of the French Navy. That is a 47 millimeter cannon, and a number of French aircraft, naval aircraft, were fitted with cannons. It's easier to hit a ship that way. It's also very good for hitting submarines. So this is a popular weapon for naval aircraft, and you'll see this repeated in the next few slides. One of the most important developments in my personal opinion of World War I was Nungesser's insistence that he wanted a more powerful weapon than the single machine gun he was using in combat. He wanted something that he hit it and destroyed it. And so he asked the Spad firm to help develop a cannon-armed Spad. This is a 37 millimeter Crude cannon, and it's mounted in the engine block of a Spad Suicisa 8C engine. Now, you see the block extending out from the engine, and that's where the control stick goes. So that had to go. It had to use a side stick control. It is sitting between the pilot's legs. The shaft, as you can see at the end, sticks out a ways and had to be removed. And this is Spad 12. You see the opening for the cannon. Now, this is probably a one-shot weapon, although there are reports occasionally somebody can get 2 shots off. They had a machine gun, and you used the machine gun to get the range of the target, and then you fired the cannon. The good news is somebody like Nungesser could use this, and it was a very successful weapon. Bad news, other pilots aren't Nungesser, and so they couldn't hit the target as easily, and they got frustrated. Nonetheless, this was an interesting idea, and the French Aviation Militaire was quite fascinated, and 300 were ordered. But in the event, only 8 to 10 ever reached the front at any one time, and that's believed to be due to engine difficulties. But I would submit this is one of the most important developments we're going to talk about today, the single-seat cannon-armed fighter. The British also went in for the cannons that were not automatic. They wanted big, powerful cannons. They didn't want something that was smaller. And so their tack was to design aircraft around the cannon. The Vickers, a 1-pounder cannon, they asked the Vickers firm to build an aircraft especially for it. This is the FB-7. It may be the only time in history that a firm went to the government and said, please cancel the contract because this aircraft won't work. Jack stole my thunder, thank you, Jack, by showing you the Supermarine PB-29 in one of his last slides. This was designed at the behest of Pemberton Billington, a very interesting and influential British air champion of the World War I. He wanted to have a Davis 6-pounder so he could shoot down Zeppelins. Probably could barely get off the ground. They also had the Roby gunships, which were not successful. And then finally, this is the Armstrong Whitworth FK-6, FK for Frederick Koolhoven, a Dutch engineer at that time employed by the firm. It has two pods located outside of the arc of the propeller. That's where the Davis 2-pound and 6-pounders will be located. These aircraft are wheelie. They're not going to be able to shoot at anything. Aside from brief experimentation with aircraft on the front, the British don't make much use of cannons, at least not in World War I. The Italians developed something that I think was very important, and that is an automatic cannon. It's lower caliber. It's 25 millimeter cannon Cimino. It is developed by Ravelli and built on a license by Fiat. And once again, you see it on a naval aircraft. This is a Machi L. This cannon was not popular, allegedly because the 25 millimeter size of the ammunition was not considered to be adequate, but actually the real problem was it wasn't fused properly, and the weapons tended to detonate well before they ever reached the target.